The first 6 months of 1942 did not go well for the British. They surrendered in Singapore. They were driven out of Burma. And they finally lost Tobruk. These indeed were dark days. In the Atlantic, U-boats were sinking 140 British merchant ships per month. In the Mediterranean, Malta was under constant siege. And in the desert, Rommel had just inflicted humiliating defeats on the British Eighth Army at Gazala and Mersa Matruh. Parliament now questioned Churchill's leadership. He survived a vote of no confidence. But how much longer could Britain survive? As if it was a last chance, Britain now committed itself to its campaign in the Western Desert. Could this be where the fortunes of war might change? Could this, in some miraculous way, be the scene of Britain's military turning point? At the end of 1941, General Sir Alan Brooke became head of the British Armed Forces. Together with Prime Minister Winston Churchill, they devised a new strategy for defeating Nazi Germany. It was at this point that America entered the war, following the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor. Churchill immediately headed to America, and there he persuaded the Americans under President Roosevelt to agree to his strategy. At its core, the plan was to take control of the Mediterranean. This would free up shipping for offensive operations, particularly sea landings in the future in both Italy and France. But in 1942, such operations were not possible because the Allied fleet was occupied with taking the long sea route around Africa in order to service operations in Egypt, India, Ceylon, and Burma. The first step of this strategy was, therefore, to defeat Rommel and beat off the Axis attacks on Malta in order to take control of the Mediterranean. Additionally, Britain needed to prove to its new partner, the United States of America, that they were capable of defeating the Germans. On the 25th of June 1942, General Claude Auchinleck, the Commander-in-Chief of British forces in the Middle East, dismissed Lieutenant General Neil Ritchie as Commander of the Eighth Army and assumed direct command himself. This followed the Eighth Army's rout at Gazala, then the fall of Tobruk, and then a further defeat by Rommel at Mersa Matruh. Ritchie had been planning to fall back 100 miles from Mersa Matruh to Fuka, where he intended once again to stand and face Rommel. Auchinleck thought that this was unwise. The Eighth Army was short of tanks after the defeat at Gazala, and without sufficient armour, Rommel would have little difficulty punching through the centre of the British line or outflanking the Eighth Army to the south. Instead, Auchinleck decided to employ delaying tactics, while withdrawing his army an additional 100 miles east to a more easily defendable position. For this, he chose El Alamein. El Alamein is an inconsequential railway station on the north coast of Egypt. A little more than 30 miles to the south is the Qattara Depression, a steep-sided subterranean area that is impassable for tanks. Here, Rommel would not be able to repeat his trademark outflanking manoeuvres. So, Auchinleck would be able to establish a defined front that his infantry could defend. While preparing the Alamein position, Auchinleck undertook a fighting withdrawal from Mersa Matruh and through Fouca, with feints and minor attacks on the enemy to keep them off balance. After 5 days, the 8th Army had successfully withdrawn to El Alamein. Auchinleck placed 30 corps, consisting of 3 infantry divisions, in the north section of the line, and 13 corps with 2 infantry divisions in the south. The remains of the 1st Armoured Division and the 7th Armoured Division were held behind the front lines as mobile reserves. Rommel arrived at El Alamein the day later, on the 30th of June, and planned to strike immediately before the British had time to properly organise their defences. He was confident that the momentum of a quick attack would take him through the British lines, and then he could advance to the Nile with little further opposition. The battle started with a 5-day onslaught by Rommel, as he unleashed a full-scale attack. But the British defences held, despite all his efforts. However, in doing this, Rommel was losing tanks fast. By the end of the 5th day, Rommel ordered his exhausted troops to dig in, rest and regroup. He had little option, because he was running out of fuel, and his long and extended supply lines were now being harried by the RAF's Desert Air Force. To make matters worse, there was increasingly less supplies getting through from Italy, as the RAF and the Royal Navy started to take control of the skies and seas around Malta. Meanwhile, the 8th Army was reorganising and rebuilding. It had the benefit of shorter supply lines. Within days of the start of the battle, the Australian 9th Division entered the line in the north, and a further 2 Indian infantry brigades arrived to further bolster the defences. Just 3 days after Rommel called a halt to his attacks, Auchinleck was able to start harassing operations against Rommel. A bombardment scattered the inexperienced soldiers of a newly formed Italian infantry division, while an Australian attack took more than 1,500 Italian prisoners, routed another Italian division, and overran the German Signals Intercept Company. The loss of the Signals Company was a major blow for Rommel, who now lost the priceless intelligence from intercepted British radio communications. As Auchinleck's attacks grew in strength, Rommel found himself plugging potential holes in his defences. He committed his German panzer divisions to counterattacks where the British were threatening to penetrate his lines. But by doing this, he sustained further tank losses from well-dug-in British artillery and anti-tank guns. For 2 weeks, both sides attacked and counterattacked each other from their increasingly well-organised defences. On the 26th of July, Auchinleck ordered one final major assault on the Axis line in the north. But again, Rommel counterattacked. By now, both armies were exhausted, and Auchinleck called a halt to further offensive operations and ordered the strengthening of the 8th Army's defensive positions. The battle was a stalemate, but at least the British had, after months of defeat, halted Rommel, who was no longer in a position to make further advances. Clearly, Auchinleck had demonstrated quality leadership and command of the 8th Army. He had extracted it from a precarious position He had stopped Rommel in his tracks at El Alamein, and he had prevented the fall of Egypt and especially the Suez Canal to the Axis forces. He had also created a substantial legacy in the form of a strong and effective defensive position. Additionally, he had plucked Francis de Gingoud, known by his colleagues as Freddy, from his post in Cairo as the regional director of military intelligence, and had appointed him as the chief of staff of the 8th Army. De Gingoud just happened to be a man who got along with the next commander of the 8th Army, Bernard Montgomery, a man known for being difficult with colleagues. De Gingoud was to remain with Montgomery for the remainder of the war, and helped him plan all his operations from El Alamein to D-Day to the crossing of the Rhine. About de Gingoud, Montgomery was later in the war to write, "I do not know what I should do without him, as he's quite first class." For his political masters, though, Auchinleck's efforts in North Africa were too little, too late. Churchill, having managed to persuade the Americans to adopt the British strategy for defeating Hitler, now desperately needed the British to demonstrate to the Americans their military capability by defeating Rommel. Churchill arrived in Cairo in early August and replaced Auchinleck as Commander-in-Chief Middle East with General Harold Alexander, the man who had commanded the rearguard at Dunkirk and who had been the last soldier to be taken off the beaches. 3 days later, on the 13th of August, General Bernard Montgomery arrived to take command of the 8th Army. Alexander immediately set about ensuring that the 8th Army was properly resourced with both men and equipment. The army was enlarged in size from 2 corps to 3. The number of tanks was greatly increased with the arrival of the Sherman. This was a British redesigned American tank, which was to become the armoured backbone of the British and American armies for the remainder of the war. Additionally, 6-pounder anti-tank guns arrived to replace the obsolete 2-pounders. Meanwhile, Montgomery focused on retraining the 8th Army and on improving its morale. He dispelled all notions that the British Army was inferior to the German Army and that Rommel, the Desert Fox, was an invincible commander. In early August, British military intelligence became aware that Rommel was planning a major armoured assault on the southern sector of the British line. Auchinleck and de Gingoud drew up contingency plans to deal with such an attack. But when it did happen, it was left to the new commander of the 8th Army to execute those plans. The attack started on the 30th of August. Rommel believed that there was a weak point in the southern sector of the British line, which was lightly held and lightly mined. He realised that he was unlikely to surprise the British with a frontal attack, so he planned to use speed, breaking through the southern sector rapidly to cut the British 8th Army's communications, throwing them off balance and disjointing their defences. He would then turn north in a sharp left hook, cutting Allied supply lines and surrounding enemy units in the north. This would leave open his conquest of Egypt and the capture of the Suez Canal. From the start, things went wrong for Rommel. The RAF spotted Axis vehicles concentrating for the attack and unleashed several successful air attacks on them. Despite these difficulties, Rommel's forces managed to cross the British minefields by the following midday and had wheeled left ready to carry out their main attack. This happened to be directly towards where Montgomery had prepared his defences, on a ridge known as Alam el Halfa, Here, the British had dug in their tanks and anti-tank guns. They were under strict orders from Montgomery to spare their tanks because they would be needed for the assault that Montgomery was planning later. Therefore, they were ordered to remain in their defensive positions. So, unlike previous encounters where the British cavalry had charged the enemy and had been picked off by Rommel's tanks and anti-tank guns, this time the roles were reversed. Rommel's tanks were destroyed as they came onto British tank and artillery guns, which were supported by Allied air attacks, who also accounted for a large number of Rommel's transport vehicles. After 5 days, trying to break the British defensive position around Alamein, Rommel decided to abandon the offensive, citing a lack of fuel, Allied air superiority, and the loss of surprise. The reality was, he had sustained 3,000 casualties compared to less than half that number in the 8th Army. After the Battle of Alam el Halfa, Rommel's army had little option other than to dig in and wait for the 8th Army to attack. Their supply position was not improving as the British continued to tighten their control of the Mediterranean. Also, for Germany, the priority was now the Russian front, which left scant resources with which Germany could reinforce Rommel. At the same time, the strength of the 8th Army was still growing. Deception plans had to be used to disguise both the build-up of troops and any future point of attack. Dummy tanks, made from wood and canvas, were speedily deployed behind the northern sector of the British line to suggest to Rommel that this had always been their strongest sector. As new Sherman tanks arrived, they replaced these dummy tanks with the dummy tanks being moved to the southern sector of the line, again suggesting that the British build-up was in the south. To add to this deception, a dummy fuel pipeline was dug all the way to the southern sector. The Germans now thought that any forthcoming attack could come in the south, and consequently the deployment of their most effective asset, the panzer units, was compromised when the attack eventually came in the north. In late September, Rommel fell ill and returned to Germany on sick leave. General George Stuhm was transferred from the Russian front to take his place. Before leaving, Rommel organized his army's defenses, and he also wrote a long appreciation of the situation to the German High Command. He set out the essential needs of his army in the full knowledge that the 8th Army would soon be strong enough to attack. Rommel pinned his hopes on the German armies fighting at Stalingrad, managing to quickly defeat the Red Army, and then move south to threaten Persia and the Middle East, from where Britain obtained its oil supplies. This would result in Britain having to fight on two fronts, and they would have to draw off large numbers of British and Commonwealth forces from the 8th Army to reinforce the 9th Army, currently holding the Transjordan region, from where Alexander had already robbed troops in order to bolster the 8th Army. This would leave the British in a position where they would be unable to attack his army. Rommel therefore hoped to convince the German High Command to reinforce his forces for the eventual link-up between his Africa Corps and the German armies fighting in southern Russia. Meanwhile, Montgomery was planning a 12-day battle in 3 stages, which he described as the break-in, the dogfight, and finally the breaking of the enemy. The aim was not just to defeat Rommel, but to do so in such a way that would degrade his army so it was no longer a threat in North Africa. In reality, the battle was to last for 19 days and was in 5 stages: the break-in, the crumbling operation, the Axis counter, Operation Supercharge, and the breakout. On the 23rd of October, Montgomery launched the first phase of the battle, called Operation Lightfoot. This consisted of a 5.5-hour nighttime bombardment with nearly 900 guns firing over 500,000 shells. This barrage provided cover for the infantry to move forward, to secure ground in order for the engineers to clear corridors through the German minefields, through which tanks could move forward. In reality, there were limited gains for the British on the opening days. The Axis, however, suffered a serious casualty when General Stoom collapsed and died from a heart attack on the second day of the battle. But Rommel was already on his way and resumed command when he arrived on the evening of the following day. It was clear that the Germans were not going to be shifted easily, and soon Montgomery had to abandon his southern corridor through the minefields. Instead, Montgomery found himself grinding the enemy down in what became known as a crumbling operation. At the same time, the British were achieving air superiority. As the British secured and destroyed Axis airfields, the importance of the air battle became clearer, with the Desert Air Force pounding German positions and attacking their vulnerable supply lines. By the 9th day of the battle, on the 1st of November, Rommel was in difficulty. Although his troops had fought doggedly and inflicted considerable casualties on the Allied forces, Montgomery's armour now outnumbered Rommel's by roughly 10-1. And being increasingly short of fuel, the Germans were making desperate efforts to airlift fuel from Greece. On that day, Rommel asked Hitler for permission to withdraw. The following day, Hitler issued his customary stand fast order, which was supported by a signal that read, "Considerable Air Force reinforcements are being sent." Of course, they never materialized. Rommel was stunned by this message and later wrote, "For the first time in the African campaign, I did not know what to do. A kind of apathy took hold of us as we issued orders for all existing positions to be held on instruction from the highest authority." Montgomery was now piling on the pressure. On the night of the 3rd and the 4th of November, he ordered 3 infantry brigades that had been held in reserve to advance to the Ramen track as a prelude to an armoured breakout. By morning, further infantry brigades had also moved forward and had captured enemy positions. Now, the 1st, 7th and 10th Armoured Divisions cut through Rommel's lines in the gap that the infantry had opened up. With his lines compromised and no further reply back from Germany following a second request to retreat, Rommel ordered a general withdrawal. But the delay in withdrawing meant that a great number of Rommel's troops and armour were cut off from the line of retreat, resulting in a further 30,000 being taken prisoner. As would happen at Stalingrad, Hitler's refusal to give ground achieved nothing other than increasing his losses on the battlefield. However, at this point, Montgomery hesitated, and Rommel was able to break away with the German 90th Light Division covering the German retreat. Over the next 6 days, Montgomery pursued the remains of Rommel's army, who did not stop until it reached Tunisia. The British victory at Alamein, and a few months later the Russian victory at Stalingrad, marked the watershed of the Second World War in Europe. Before these battles, the Axis carried all before them. From this point on, the Axis would be on the back foot. the battles fought at El Alamein were truly a pivotal moment in the war.
Rommel's army has been defeated. It has been routed. It has been very largely destroyed as a fighting force. This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning.